for our lovely, lovely trainers. I'm clapping. I'm hoping you guys are clapping too.
Thanks, August. Thank you. Okay, Kathy and Evan, why don't you take it over then?
Thank you so much for that, August. And thank you, Robin and Jody and all the folks from E4E that have invited us to be able to provide this training today. My name is Kathy Molig. She, her are my pronouns. I am the founder and executive director of TransFamily Support Services. Just a little bit of information about us. We provide navigation for the journey is our tagline. So basically anything that might come up for a trans or non-binary person or their family, we either provide the service or we can lead you to the right people that provide the service. I am also the parent of a trans person. My son started his transition when he was 11 years old, a decade ago. And the world looked very different a decade ago than it does now. As I was advocating for his needs, making sure that I could find doctors who were willing to treat him because there were no doctors in San Diego that wanted to treat him, getting the schools to do what they needed to be doing to support him. Other families were coming along and asking if I would help them with their trans kids. And so I did that for a few years and then started the organization 7 years ago. And to date, we have served just over 2,300 trans individuals and their families across the country. So while we're based here in San Diego County, we do serve people all over the country. So while I get my screen share up, Evan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Of course. Thank you, Kathy. Good evening, everyone. My name is Evan Johnson. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I am the Community and Youth Programming Manager for TransFamily Support Services. I started working with this organization about 6 years ago, right out of high school. And it started with just volunteering for facilitating an LGBTQ support group for high schoolers. And since then, it has expanded to all this lovely work that we've done. In that time, I have graduated with my bachelor's in social work from SDSU. So that definitely colors my my navigating this particular content and how to go about things like education. And I hope that it makes it just a little bit more accessible.
Awesome. Thanks, Evan. So as we get rolling today, you all can read the slides, so we're not going to do that. There's just a couple of things. If you can possibly leave your camera on, we appreciate it. We know not everybody can, but as you can imagine, being presenters in this world for over 2 years now with doing this virtually, it sure is nice to be able to see people's faces and their reactions as opposed to a whole bunch of black boxes. And please do feel free to use that reaction button. If you're not familiar with it, it's down in the bottom menu of Zoom. You can raise your hand, you can make a happy face, you can do all kinds of lovely things there. Evan and I will be taking turns looking at the chat box. So if you put comments or questions in there, we'll be happy to respond to them. Our biggest piece about this presentation as far as our goals is we're here to provide information and education. That's what it is, and not here to change anybody's values or beliefs. There may be times that your values and beliefs might get pushed up against, and just know that if this is happening for you, that we're going to provide some space for that to be able to be, it might be a little uncomfortable, but not too uncomfortable.
And in addition to creating some expectations for us as presenters, we also like to create some expectations for this space that we're all sharing tonight. So we come into this conversation assuming that we are all here with good intentions. We encourage you to be patient with yourselves and your peers in this conversation. For some of us, this information may be really new, and new things can sometimes be intimidating, but we ask that you be willing to try some of these new things that we offer. We give a lot of action steps in order to be allies to this community, as well as this piece, like Kathy said, we're not here to change your beliefs. It's when those beliefs become biases and those biases impact the work that we do, that we may have to re-examine them and set them aside. It's also super relevant that we acknowledge that we are on occupied land here in San Diego. We are on the land of the Kumeyaay people. If you are not in San Diego, I encourage you to go to native-land.ca, type in your zip code or your city, and you can see whose land you are on. But for those of us who are in San Diego proper, the Kumeyaay have been the documented protectors and caregivers for 12,000 years, and they will continue to be the rightful leaders in conversations about how to best support this community. In particular, we want to call out the work being done by the Indigenous, Trans, and Two-Spirit community here in San Diego. So like I said, I'm a social worker, and if I know two things about social workers, we love Brene Brown and we hate math. So Brene Brown has this fantastic quote that I really love to start this training on: to not have these conversations because they make you uncomfortable is the definition of privilege. Your comfort is not at the center of this discussion. I encourage you to be uncomfortable during this conversation, because from discomfort is where we can recognize the gaps in our own understanding. And when we can recognize those gaps, we're able to fill them and move forward and be better allies to this community. So know that this is a safe space to experience discomfort, allow yourself to feel that discomfort, and we'll move through it together. When we're talking about the LGBTQ community, we are talking about a culture. And I think a lot of us are familiar with this idea of a cultural iceberg, that metaphor, this idea that for those of us who are outside of the culture, we only see what the very tip of the iceberg. And for individuals who are within a culture, who are under the surface of the water, there's a much bigger picture that we're missing. And so when we're talking about the LGBTQ community, that tip of the iceberg are individuals who don't have lived experience, who don't have loved ones with lived experience, and maybe have never sought out LGBTQ media or news sources before. But as we start to add those layers of exposure and experience, we start to get a fuller picture. So we come into this conversation with the assumption that we are all at the very tip of the iceberg. So that's why some of this information may seem a little bit basic, but it's to make sure we can all have that full conversation in its wholeness together. And of course, when we're having any sort of conversation about best supporting a marginalized population, it is super relevant that we discuss this idea of cultural competency. So we actually do not practice cultural competency. That is not the point of this training, because cultural competency is what gets us stuck in this expert trap. This idea that, well, I know what's best for you because I attended a training. But we know that these experiences of marginalized people are not universal. Even those of us within marginalized identities do not have universal or monolithic experiences. And so rather this idea of competency, we switch to the idea of cultural humility. And so being able to say, I don't have all the answers, I don't know all the things, and allowing the population that we're serving to tell us the best way to support them. So this allows us to ask questions, to make mistakes, and to continue to open up lines of communication between ourselves and the individuals that we're serving. Since we're talking about the LGBTQ community, we talk in terms of allyship. The goal of allyship is not to know the community. It is to listen to their stories and understand that you don't always have the same experience. And all of this is being done in an effort to create safe spaces, but safe spaces are not just physical or geographic locations. Safe spaces are also individuals within locations. I think a really prime example of this is when we see organizations like Free Mom Hugs, where individuals who wear these shirts of Free Mom Hugs or Free Dad Hugs, they're establishing themselves as safe spaces for LGBTQ individuals to get parental support and guidance. And so this piece of establishing yourself as an ally, even within a safe space, establishing that you are also here to strengthen that safe space.
And then as we get into, the kind of the meat of this, if you will, looking at gender identity. So we all have a gender identity. It's just that most of us live in the privilege that we haven't really had to think much about our gender identity, because who we are is in alignment with our sex assigned at birth. Gender identity is defined as the innate sense of knowing who you are. It's based in our brain. We live in a society that has conflated that to be equal to what the doctor declares at birth, and that is not necessarily the case for everyone. Researchers have discovered that most of us know our gender identity somewhere between the ages of 3 and 5. That does not necessarily mean we know what to do with that information at the ages of 3 to 5. But any of you that are parents or worked in early childhood, you know that inevitably on a playground, you're going to hear something like, you can't be the mama silly because you're a boy. Our kids get very definite messages around gender and how they are to perform gender from the world around them on a consistent basis. Our society is very stuck in these binaries of pink and blue. Child gets assigned a certain sex at birth, a boy sex at birth. They're going to wear these clothes, have these hairstyles, play with these toys, grow up and do these jobs, and the same for girls. And so today we want to think outside of these two binary boxes when we're talking about gender. I like to equate it to handedness. So is there anybody in the room that is left-handed? And since I can't see everybody all at the same time, can you just unmute yourself and tell me your first name if you are left-handed?
Jody.
Jody. Any other left-handed folks? All right, Jody, it's me and you. So Jody, can you tell the rest of us, at what age did you decide to be left-handed?
Oh, that's an interesting question because I can just remember being forced in a right-handed desk and being so irritated and corrected all the time. And I had to distort my body to fit the right-handed desk. I would say like 7 or 8. I'm guessing.
So did you decide to be left-handed at 7 or 8?
I think I decided to, yeah, actually, because I kept trying to be corrected to be right-handed, but that wasn't natural to me. And so
right. So
I said, no.
That innate sense was to be left-handed, but you kept being put into being a right-handed person, right? Because our kids don't decide to be left-handed any more than a child decides to be transgender. That just doesn't happen. Left-handedness is an innate sense of yourself. We don't see our preschoolers picking up a crayon and trying to figure out which hand does it feel better in, which hand can I color better with. They just pick up a crayon and go, right? And then we hear things like Jody just talked about, that, you know, as a left-handed person in a right-handed world, the challenges that come with that, desk, spiral notebooks, scissors, you know, all sorts of things that our left-handed individuals have to overcome in order to be successful in their world. And just like Jody was talking about, there was for decades this push to make all left-handed people right-handed. This book was published in the 1930s, The Prevention and Correction of Left-Handedness in Children. There was a thought process in our country that left-handedness was wrong and bad, needed to be prevented or corrected at all costs. And in some religious cultures, they believed that left-handedness was a sign of the devil. So some of you may have relatives, some of you may be old enough to remember classmates that the teachers would tie kids' hands behind their back if they tried to use their left hand. In parochial schools, the nuns would whack your hand with a ruler if you picked up your pencil with your left hand. There is a lot of energy around not allowing individuals to be innately who they are. And it is not unlike what we're seeing now within our own community when it comes to trans and non-binary folk. So it wasn't until about the 1970s, researchers discovered that there was an uptick of left-handed people in our country. Does anybody want to either put in the chat or unmute and tell me, what idea do you think? What reason do you think there was that there were more left-handed people starting in the early 70s than there had been previously? I know you're all very smart people and somebody has an idea. And you're all tired people. I can tell. End of the day. Anyone? What happened in the 70s?
I'll guess. Was it the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act?
The ADA. Close. So I see in the chat, I also see there were the same amount. They just felt more comfortable sharing. Bingo, winner, winner. So what made them feel more comfortable being left-handed, because as kids, a lot of our kids wouldn't know it wasn't a thing to say that you were, right? But what happened is we started to see visibility of left-handed people being successful, and in particular, athletes, successful left-handed athletes that opened up this visibility piece for other people to be okay being left-handed. And slowly, the culture of our country changed from left-handedness being this wrong, bad, and evil thing to left-handedness was okay. We started to see the invention of things like left-handed scissors and those sorts of things. But it wasn't until that visibility came along, which we can correlate very much to right now. We hear lots and lots in our work about, oh, well, they're just trans because it's the trendy thing, it's the new thing. No, people are coming out and sharing their identity with us because we have opened up a space for it to be safe for them to share their identity with us. And so this video shares a little bit about what that looks like for our younger individuals. Oh, I need to share my sound real quick. Sorry, I forgot to do that.
6 years ago, I gave birth to my first and only child. A boy.
Hello. I am 38. I'm 29, and I really love you.
When he was 2 years old, my son began insisting on wearing only pink clothes, preferably ones with lots of sparkles and ruffles on them.
She dresses so pretty. She really loves me. She really.
When he turned 3, he begged me to buy him some dresses and let him grow his hair long. That made the grandparents a little nervous, but we went with it.
That one's a fairy and that one's a princess.
Why is she a fairy and she's a princess?
Because fairies are magic and princesses don't. That's the difference. And also, they can't fly and they can. Fairies fly and princesses walk.
And then one day, in a conversation that I kind of knew was coming, but it still knocked the wind out of me, my child told me that he was actually a girl, not a boy. He looked me in the eyes and told me something had gone wrong in my tummy that made him come out as a boy instead of a girl. He wanted me to put him back. He begged me to put him back, to fix this mistake. He was 3 years old. I spent the following year resisting, trying to present alternatives. I told my child over and over again that he could continue to be a boy and play with all the Barbies he wanted and wear whatever he liked, dresses, skirts, all the sparkles money could buy. But my child said no, absolutely not. She was a girl.
What are your favorite things to play with?
My princess things.
Your princess things? Why do you like princesses so much?
I just kind of do.
Do you think it's okay for boys to like princesses?
But I'm a girl.
After 12 long months of making both myself and my child miserable, I finally let my little boy go.
Goodbye. Hello. Now let's do it. Twinkle, twinkle, little star.
We switched to female pronouns and told our family and friends that she was a girl now. She wanted a new name, a girl name. At first, she picked Rainbow. I was relieved when she changed her mind and named herself after her aunt. So now I have a girl,
Talk about princesses.
a daughter.
Actually, I need to hear about how spaceships fly.
A really happy daughter. I adore my daughter. But sometimes I look at photos of my baby boy and I miss him so much. This probably sounds crazy, but sometimes I wonder where he is. It's like he was a dream I had one night, and then morning came and I woke up and he was gone. And now there's this little girl in his place, telling me that the boy was just a dream, just someone I imagined. As far as she is concerned, there never was a boy.
Could you explain that to me one more time? What's the difference between you and Holly?
She has a vagina and I have a penis.
She
I'm a
has-
girl with a penis and she is a girl with a vagina.
You're a girl with a penis and she's a girl with a vagina?
Yes.
So now that I have a daughter instead of a son, what does this actually mean for her? And for me as her mother?
Pink is a mama. Pink is a mama.
Other than letting her wear pretty dresses and using different pronouns, what has actually changed? What does this newly minted girl need to know? What do I need to teach her about how to be a girl?
The girl alien does all the work while the boy alien sleeps and eats.
Do I even know how to be a girl?
The girls also have blue and purple spots.
And if a girl can be a senator or an astronaut or a plumber, if a girl can wear pants and have short hair, if a girl can even have a penis, what is a girl anyway?
Who gets to decide if you're a boy or girl?
Me.
Okay, so let's talk about that video because first of all, it's an absolutely darling video, and every time I see it, I love it. In particular because, like, I mean, come on, the girl alien does all the work while the boy alien sleeps and eats. Me too. All I do is sleep and eat. I love that for her. So, but there's a couple of really important pieces that this mom touches on in her journey with her daughter. That was episode 1 of How to Be a Girl. We can find it at howtobeagirlpodcast.com. And mom started making these videos when kiddo was about 6 years old. Kiddo is now in middle school, so there's quite a bit of content to go through. If that's something you're interested in, personally, I really like it. 2 really big points in this episode, though, and why we show it. So first of all, mom was able to say to kiddo, hey, did you know that boys can like pink and dresses and sparkles? You could be a boy and like all those things. And kiddo was able to say back, like, that's great, but I'm a girl. Right? So we know that this had nothing to do with the fear of those things being taken away from kiddo, the fear of favorite toy being taken away, because she knows that mom is going to let her have it regardless. And then this other piece is a little bit more subtle. It's this piece that for many of our youth, when they're coming out, a lot of the times, like Kathy mentioned earlier, you know, we want to say it's some sort of piece of social contagion, that they're getting this from their friends, they're getting this from their peers. Now, I worked as a nanny for a very long time. This kiddo was 3 when she started expressing to mom that she was a girl. And now I know what my 3-year-old was watching on her iPad while I cooked breakfast, right? She wasn't watching like Pose or other trans media. She was watching Peppa Pig and like Bluey. So like there's not that piece of this is a 3-year-old who's being taught these ideas by someone. This is innate to who she is. And you notice that she uses language like I'm a girl, not language like I'm transgender, showing us that this is a piece of her identity and she is using the language that she currently has to express that to mom. Depending on what stage our kiddos are coming out to us, that changes the language that they have. They may have access to the word transgender, but they may not yet have heard that word. And so they may think they're the only person in the world who's felt like this. And so they're just going to use what words they do have in order to express it. So really good story, really good points that are made there, and some things for us to hold on to as we navigate the rest of this conversation. This slide is I wish I could say this was the rest of the conversation, but this slide is a fraction of it. It is a long slide to get through. And so for a second, we're going to focus on the people, the faces, and we're going to ignore the slide because this is horrible. There are a lot of terms and definitions used in reference to the LGBTQ community. We have a lot of identities, and each individual person with each individual identity may define that identity uniquely to their own experiences. And that's okay. So while we have this graphic, and this graphic is heavy on the definitions, these definitions are working definitions that were crafted with the support of individuals who are within these identities. These are not universal definitions. Each individual may define their identities a little bit uniquely, and that's something to empower kiddos to do and empower individuals to do. So we're going to work through it just so we have some basic understanding of what some of these words mean, but honestly, take it with a grain of salt. What's really going to matter is when somebody comes out to you saying, okay, what does that mean for you? How do I support you? So we're going to start with what's familiar. L, lesbian, we all know of a lesbian. I personally know of too many lesbians. My sister's a lesbian, and I have to live with that for the rest of my life. But a lesbian is a feminine identified person primarily attracted to other women. Gay is the inverse of lesbian, a masculine identified person primarily attracted to other men, except not always. And we already start to see a little bit of flexibility when it comes to these terms, because for many individuals who may identify as non-heterosexual or anything different than straight, they may shorthand their identity to gay because our society knows what the word gay means. It's easier to say, well, I'm gay, than to explain the nuances of your attraction. So we already start to see that flexibility. We move forward to be bisexual. In the past, a bisexual person has been somebody who experiences attraction to men and women, but as we expand our ideas of gender, this definition also expands. And so a more contemporary definition may be a person who experiences attraction to those of the same and different gender identities. Moving away from sexual orientations and into gender identities, we have two T's. Our first T is transgender. A transgender person is any person whose gender identity is different than their sex assigned at birth. It is the shortest definition on here for really good reason. There are no other requirements for a person to identify as trans. The only requirement is if you know yourself to be that identity piece different than your sex assigned at birth, and this word transgender feels right for you, then it is right for you. And that's the only requirement. Our other T that we have up here is a little bit more tricky. It's a little bit more complex. So this word transsexual was largely coined by the medical and psychological communities in order to make a difference between individuals who said they were trans from individuals who were actually trans, people who had obtained some form of medical transition. And so in creating this distinction, we created this really harmful barrier to individuals who were unable to access things like medical transition, or who didn't want to access medical transition, where they could no longer access the same resources that other trans individuals were getting access to. And so we as a community have largely gone away with using this term transsexual. We don't use it so much in the broader sense. There are definitely individuals who on a one-on-one basis may identify as transsexual. But when it comes to like our name, when you see trans in shorthand, like TransFamily Support Services, know that that's typically going to be short for transgender, not transsexual. And kind of staying along these themes of complex words, we have our first Q, queer. For many of us, we may remember when the word queer was absolutely not a word you would ever see in polite company. But there's something really interesting that happens with language, and that's that it is constantly evolving, right? And so this piece of, for many of us who identify as non-heterosexual or non-cisgender, who identify as a part of the LGBTQ community, we may use this term queer as a shorthand for our identity. It becomes an umbrella term for any person who is in this community. For myself personally, it's a word of safety. I have had many different jobs all alongside doing this work. And so this work has popped up on my job resumes. And so when interviewers would ask me, oh, well, TransFamily Support Services, tell me what that's about. Why are you a part of it? I didn't want to out myself as trans. And so what I would say is, well, I'm a part of the queer community. And so it's important for me to support that community. For me, queer is a word of safety, but it's really important that we're mindful of this history with the word. And we know that we're not imposing this word onto other people, but rather reflecting it as they self-identify. Our second Q that we have up here is questioning. I think it's really important that we lean into the idea of questioning being its own identity rather than a phase or a transitional identity, because for some of us, this stuff is hard. It can take us years to figure out language that feels authentic to our experiences. I mean, take my sister, when we were 13 years old, she came out to me as bi. And then she was pan, and then she was bi, and then she was gay, and then she was bi, and then she was homoflexible. And then for a minute she was straight again, and then she was gay again. And then at 21 years old, 8 years later, my sister's like, you know what? I'm lesbian-ish. That's what's gonna work for me. So it took my sister 8 years to find a word. But because she had this difficulty where she felt like she wasn't allowed to be questioning, she wasn't allowed to not know, she kept jumping between identities and she was getting scorned for it within our community. Individuals weren't taking her seriously. When she was coming out time and time again, people would just write her off. They would tell her that she was seeking attention. She was being forced to find language where language didn't exist to describe her identity. And so when we allow ourselves to look at this word questioning and say, questioning is a legitimate identity within the community, we prevent people from feeling forced to define their identities beyond what they feel ready for. And we allow people to actually find language that fits them rather than mold themselves to fit language. Our next letter that we have up here is I, intersex. A person who is intersex is someone who experiences natural variance in their sex characteristics. So this is a biological identity. This is something that's based in sex chromosomes. This can be based in genitalia, body hormones that your body naturally produces. The rate of intersex births is about the same as the rate of redheaded births at 4.6% of the population, but we don't talk about intersex individuals with that same commonality because for a very long time what was happening is when a child was born intersex, doctors would say to parents, your baby has a birth defect, take all those children into operation and make all those babies female. So child was then returned to parents who are told we fixed the problem without ever being told what the problem was. This is your daughter, raise her as a girl. Okay, great, I have a daughter. So maybe my daughter hits that age 13, 14, 15, where she starts to hit natal puberty. All of her other assigned female friends are getting breast growth development. Maybe they're starting their menstrual cycle, but this kiddo is going through what we may call a typical male puberty because she actually has internal testes. And so she's getting the facial hair, the Adam's apple, the deeper voice. Our society doesn't have a space for individuals who don't conform to what's typically expected of their sex. And because of that, the intersex community has been erased from much of our history. Now, this isn't to say that they're going to be erased forever, because obviously we're talking about them now. The intersex community has been phenomenal in their strength and in their advocacy for themselves, in particular within the past 10 years. And many intersex activists have actually come forward and have said that this process of intersex genital mutilation surgery, which is that surgery that I referred to earlier that's performed on infants, is unethical, and many hospitals will no longer be performing it. They say that it is harmful to these children, and that best practice actually is when a child is born visibly intersex, to tell the parents, to say your kid is intersex. Here's what that means for them. And if later on in life that child chooses to access any form of gender affirmation treatment, they are able to access it when they want, rather than, again, that identity being imposed upon them. With this increase in activism, we've seen an increase in visibility. I love symbols. I love the evolution of symbols. I think this symbol is really excellent. This is the Intersex Inclusive Progress Pride flag. And so we're familiar with some versions of this, right? We see the rainbow stripes. We know that that is the LGBTQ flag. We see the black and the brown stripes. Those were added in 2016 in order to be representative of the BIPOC community within the LGBTQ community. We have the blue, pink, and white stripes taken from the transgender pride flag, and then the yellow triangle with the purple circle is the intersex pride flag. Now, why is this symbol so important? What this says is, while we all have our own unique experiences within this community, we are still all one community. And that's really special. So we're all able to support one another while acknowledging that we all may have separate and unique goals and needs. So I like the symbol. I think it's fun. We're going to blast through these last couple of letters. I saw someone actually mention this in the chat. I didn't get to see the whole message because I'm trying to talk fast. But so our first A that we have up here is ally. And I do want to call out what this person said in the chat is something that we acknowledge. Not everyone is going to include A in this acronym. And that's for a really good reason, because allies are not a part of the LGBTQ community. The reason that we include allies when we do these trainings, when we have these conversations, is because we would not be able to do this work without the support of our allies. It's really important that our allies recognize the power and the impact they have within the LGBTQ community, even as individuals who are not a part of that community. They have a major impact, in particular when we're talking about youth, when we're talking about LGBT kids. And so knowing this piece of your power as an ally, knowing that allyship is an active role, it's not a passive label that you're allowed to just stick on yourself. This is something that you have to continuously exercise and remember and be mindful of. And so sometimes it can get awkward and sometimes you may get rusty in your allyship. That's okay. What's important is you continuously try to strengthen that skill. So knowing that value, knowing that power in being an ally. Our last couple of letters, A, asexual and asexual person is any person who does not experience physical attraction to those of any gender identities. P, pansexual person who experiences physical attraction to those of all gender identities.
And so as Evan started that conversation around, we don't have to understand all of this. We don't have to know all the words. We don't have to know all the different things that people use in talking about themselves. But what we do have to do is be affirming and supportive to people in this community. And too many times allies, we as allies get caught up on, I'm so sorry, I just realized I wasn't on camera. All of our allies, we can get caught up on, but I don't know the right thing to say. And so I want to reiterate what Evan started with is, if a person shares something about their identity, say, thank you so much for sharing that with me. Can you tell me more what that means to you? And then that opens up a space for them to feel the safety of you as a safe person without you having to feel like you have to have all the expert knowledge.
So we talk a lot about this term gender identity, this phrase gender identity, and what really is gender identity beyond just that brief definition that Kathy gave. We're going to break it down into its smallest possible components. So that true identity piece, that is the piece that is based in our brains, the language we use to define ourselves. We all have a gender identity. We all also have a sex assigned at birth. And sex assigned at birth is what's based in our biology. This is the sex chromosomes and genitals. This is what the doctor declares. But as we know, sex assigned at birth does not exist within a binary system. It rather exists on a spectrum. And so that can help us to ground ourselves when we're looking at something like gender identity and understanding how gender identity then also can exist on a spectrum. And then everything else about a person, the way they look, the way they sound, the way they move through a space, all of that is part of a person's gender expression. And gender expression is not necessarily indicative of a person's gender identity. And not only does it help us to be better allies to the trans and non-binary community when we're able to recognize that and separate these two things in our minds, but we also become better allies to others on an international scale, as we know that gender expression and gender presentation vary from culture to culture and across timelines. And so being able to remove ourselves from making assumptions about identity, which is a really intimate part of who a person is, based on those external cues, allows us to be more empathetic and have more genuine human connections, because we're not imposing these societal ideas that we may have about, well, what does this mean and what does this indicate? And then oh my gosh, my slides are in a different order. Okay, that's fine. And then there's gender, right? When we're talking about the trans population, or talking about who is trans, I think it's really important that we acknowledge who is not transgender first. And so outside of the trans umbrellas, that's where you'll see language like cisgender, and cisgender comes from the Latin meaning the same. So cis gender. And so cis individuals, those are just people whose gender identity is the same as their sex assigned at birth. That's where we get language like cis woman and cis man. Other individuals who are not necessarily trans are individuals who have what we may call an atypical gender expression, or a gender expression that goes across gender boundaries, right? So people who perform in drag, people who enjoy cross-dressing, these individuals are just a part of their gender expression rather than indicating something about their gender identity. Within the trans umbrella, we have our binary identities, MTF, which is a person assigned male at birth identifies as female or a trans woman. FTM, person assigned female at birth identifies as male or a trans man. Sometimes when we're looking at language like this, it might get confusing to us of understanding how does this person identify. It can be helpful for us to remember that transgender is an adjective, not a noun. And so when we see language like trans woman, we can just replace trans with any other adjective: blonde woman, tall woman, cis woman, short woman. And we understand that all of these individuals are women, and we are just describing their womanhood. Within the trans umbrella, we also have the non-binary or the gender queer umbrella. So this is any gender identity which is not explicitly male or female. There's a lot of language that you may hear in reference to the non-binary community. This is where we get language like agender or gender fluid. There are also a lot of cultural identities that fall outside of explicitly male or female. This is where you can get language like the Fa'afafine and the Fatkama of Samoa, Two-Spirit communities in some indigenous tribes in the United States and Canada, the Mushe in Oaxaca, Mexico, the Mahu in Hawaii, the Hijra in India. There are 6 genders that are represented in the original Hebrew of the Talmud. And so we know this piece of how trans and non-binary identities have always existed across cultures, across times. And this idea of the gender binary is actually a relatively new imposition, and a lot of it has to do with colonialism. And so as we move ourselves away from this newer, more geographically isolated idea of the gender binary, and we move back to this piece of the historical precedent for non-binary and trans identities, that can help ground us in supporting and advocating for this community, because it's not new. And in fact, it's an incredibly established part of our human society. Okay, this is the slide that I thought was going to happen. So if gender identity, sex assigned at birth, and gender expression, they're 3 sisters and they're over here. Sexual orientation is the cousin that's over there, and they only ever see her at the family reunion once a year. They have very little to do with one another. Our kiddos really put it best. Sexual orientation is who one goes to bed with. Gender identity is who one goes to bed as. And so being able to keep those 2 things separate in our minds. So now we're going to crunch numbers. And like I said earlier, I'm a social worker who doesn't like numbers, but these numbers are important. So the US Trans Survey comes out from the US Center for Trans Equality. This one came out in 2015. I am having a whole time apparently with my slides, but we see some of these statistics. So the previous one came out in 2015. They actually just released the pledge to do the 2022 trans survey. I encourage you to pledge to take it. Our cisgender allies can also take the survey. You can indicate that you're an ally. And so it's a smaller survey, but it's still important that we get that data. So what are some of these numbers that we see? Well, some elevated rates of some pretty disparaging statistics. I'm not going to read all of these, but I am going to call out some key points. This first one being, when we look at that 30% report experiencing homelessness at some point in their lives, we see a significant spike to 45% if their family is unsupportive versus a minor decline to 27% if the family is supportive. We see something similar reflected in suicide attempt rates, 40% being the baseline, 54% if they are lacking family support, 37% if family is supportive. And then in this piece of healthcare, 23% did not seek out care when sick or injured because of experiences of healthcare discrimination. I want to call out that this has nothing to do with a person's medical transition. What this means is that there are trans and non-binary individuals out there. We have a story from a couple of years ago here in San Diego where a trans woman broke her arm. She went to the ER and the attending physician said to her that he could not treat her because it went against his religious identity. So she was turned away. She returned home and she did not go to another ER or urgent care for long enough that by the time she did receive medical attention, they had to re-break the bone in order to properly set it. When we say that trans individuals are experiencing discrimination on a day-to-day, it is not just around trans issues or trans topics. This is something that we are navigating in every component of our lives. And so knowing this piece of how allyship to this community becomes so far beyond things like just arenas where you think you may be having trans individuals interacting with you, and rather knowing this piece of you need to be an ally to the trans community in all areas of your life. So some more numbers from that US survey. We see some higher rates of violence. In particular, we see higher rates of physical, verbal, sexual violence, intimate partner violence in the trans community, higher rates of police mistreatment and mistreatment by prison staff. I want to call out with these violence statistics, we disproportionately see these things affecting our trans women of color at the highest rates. I think every year for like the past 10 years has been the deadliest year for trans people, and a significant number and percentage of those deaths are trans women of color. And so knowing that piece of how intersectionality impacts a trans person's safety and ability to be out or even transition. In economic considerations, I already kind of alluded to this piece when I said I didn't disclose that I was trans in job interviews. It's because we see these higher rates of unemployment, of negative job ramifications. The trans population is disproportionately living in poverty. And so knowing again, this piece of how this impacts every part of our lives, not just times when our transness is at the forefront. I work in particular with our youth. I work directly with high schoolers, but I oversee all of our youth programming, and that goes from upper elementary up to young adults age 30. So I see a wide range of folks. GLSEN is the Gay and Lesbian Student Education Network. They put out a national school climate survey to LGBTQ middle and high schoolers, and we see some of these same reflection of numbers that we saw in the US trans survey. Higher rates of feeling of harassment or sexual violence at school, higher rates of feeling unsafe and avoiding school activities. And school activities, this is all sorts of things. This is dances, this is clubs, this is pep rallies, this is sporting events. This is everything outside of classroom environments. And then we see a higher school dropout rate for our trans and non-binary population. And we know how things like completing your high school education can impact job security, housing security, access to insurance, all of these other parts that we see those disproportionate statistics from those earlier slides. More about our youth, they report higher rates of bullying, higher rates of homelessness. A lot of that has to do with being kicked out of the home for their LGBTQ identity. And then this piece of 51% of trans youth denied access to restrooms consistent with their gender identity. I want to really break this one down because I think we miss the big picture. When we're looking at denial to access, denial to restrooms, right? When we're looking at a lack of access, this is so much more than people just need to pee. So when I was a kid, when I was 13 years old, I started to express myself a little bit more masculinely. And to my classmates, that marked me as a lesbian. And so I was no longer welcome in female spaces at my school. My peers, if I tried to walk into the girls' restroom, they would mock me, they would belittle me, they would make comments until I eventually left. And so I didn't feel safe in the girls' restroom. I was not going to go into the boys' restroom because it's stinky. 8th grade boys are disgusting, and I wanted nothing to do with that. And so I'm at school for 8, 10, 12 hours a day because of before and after school activities. And in all of that time, I'm not using the restroom. So what am I doing? Well, I started avoiding food and drink so that I wouldn't have the concern of having to go pee at school. Even now, if I'm at a restaurant, I am very mindful of how much water I'm drinking because I'm not sure what the restroom situation looks like. And I know that this isn't just me. We see higher rates of disordered eating, higher rates of dehydration, higher rates of restriction in the trans and non-binary population due to avoidance of restrooms, higher rates of UTIs, kidney and bladder infections. The list goes on and on. This is a health epidemic against this community. So when we talk about bathrooms, we're talking about so much more than just going pee. We're talking about health and wellness and safety. And then this is the statistic that I have beef with, and I don't think it really surprises anyone as a number, but this is just here in California. My slides have gone so far away. Is everyone else also looking at that GLSEN school climate survey slide? Sick. All right. We're on the right slide. We're having tech stuff today. So this is the statistic that I have a personal issue with. This is just here in California, 52% of trans students have considered suicide compared to just 16% for their cisgender peers. I want us to lean into the statistic for a second because that is just here in California. I don't know if y'all are following what's going on in Texas or Alabama for our trans kids. I don't even want to think about what this number looks like for them. I don't know if you know this, California is a pretty phenomenal state for our trans youth. There are some pretty stellar protections for them. And yet we still see this 52%. And so how do we start to change that? How do we see that impact? A lot of it has to do with social support, right? So we're not here to tell you that it's hopeless when somebody comes out as trans. We're here to give you the steps in order to support the community and to hopefully change this number. The Trevor Project, which is an LGBTQ suicide prevention hotline, actually put out data just this past year, and my slide will click, in this past year that having one affirming adult in an LGBTQ person's life will cut their suicide attempt rate by 40%. That is a huge number. And this isn't one person in their household. This isn't one adult person who they see every day. This is one person in their life who is affirming. For me, it was a teacher whose class I never even took. My sister had a 0 period and he had a coffee machine. So I hung out in his classroom, I did homework. And one day, he was the first adult I ever came out to. I said, "Hey, I think I might be non-binary." And he didn't belittle me. He didn't even say anything much on it. But after a minute, he looked at me and he said, "So are you Mr. or Miss Johnson?" And I said, "Ooh, I don't know." And he looked it up with me. It's mix, MX. I personally don't like it, so I will just be getting my doctorate and being Dr. Johnson, ignoring the whole problem. But the fact that this one adult sought out how to best affirm me with his language rather than try to, I don't know, figure out why I was identifying like this or where I had gotten that idea or to kick me out of his classroom. He just naturally wanted to affirm me. Now, I never took his class because I'm not a science person. He taught human bio, but I did eat lunch in his classroom every day for my junior and senior year. He was the person I went to if I had any issues on campus. I went straight to his classroom and he'd take me to the counselor. He'd take me to the assistant principal. He'd let me hang out in his back room until I cooled off and I felt ready to go back to class. This was the person who made school safe for me. One adult. And it doesn't stop being affirming once a person is 18 years old. I didn't come out to my parents until I was 21. And that was a whole journey. But that following Christmas, after I'd come out to them, after I had told them my name, my mom got me this bracelet that says my new name on it, right? It says Evan Alyssa. That's me. And when I opened the box, I made eye contact with her, just started sobbing. Because after years and years of my parents not getting it, not understanding, not affirming me, finally, they were actually acknowledging my name. And that erased all of the damage and all of the harm, at least in that moment, of some of the missteps that they had made. Because now they were trying to recover. Affirmation of trans identity saves lives. It is always going to save lives, whether that is working with youth or working with adults. And so again, knowing your power as an ally to this community, knowing your ability to tell someone that they are safe with you and that you will respect them for who they tell you they are. It is life-changing and it is life-saving.
And so as we move forward, that piece around the life-saving, the life-changing, family support means everything. This is the core of the work that we do, is making sure that every trans person, in particular minors, have at least one family member who is affirming and supportive of their identity. Because we know things like the Family Acceptance Project, which is a program at UCSF, that rejection from family can have such dire consequences for individuals, that it's just vitally important. And then Evan talked about the statistics that we see and the reality in which our trans women of color in particular have to face. And when we think about intersectionality, our minds go typically to things like race or immigration status. Those are really important for us to be considering and educating ourselves and making a change. But I want you to take a minute and read all of those circles, because all of those pieces make up an individual as a whole person. I can share from our experience. My son has a disability. My son has fetal alcohol syndrome. We adopted him as an infant. And so because of his disability, we've been seeing mental health and medical providers from day one for him. And at about age 9, he started to show increased anxiety and depression. He started withdrawing from things that used to bring him joy. He didn't want to go to school. He didn't want to leave the house. He would have these 4 or 5 hour long crying hysterical fits and could not tell us why. And as I was working with the mental health and medical providers and seeing them through these several years of this information, I would say to them, I think there's a gender issue here. And the response I got back repeatedly from these well-intended but highly uneducated professionals was, no, remember his disability, his brain works differently, he's confused. We nearly lost our son because no one was able to really give us the appropriate information we needed to support him.
And so when Kathy's talking about this distress that her son was going through, what we're talking about from a clinical perspective is referred to as gender dysphoria. So there's a whole ton of information out there about gender dysphoria. What's relevant for us to know in a non-clinical setting is two things. One, gender dysphoria is the DSM diagnosis that a trans person is required to get in order to obtain any form of medical transition. So we have to be diagnosed as trans, right? So that's its own thing. The other piece is because of this affiliation with the DSM, all of us within this community, we may define our dysphoria a little bit uniquely and a little bit differently. So I personally define my dysphoria as the distress that I as a trans person experience based on the way society perceives me versus who I know myself to be. I was not born in the wrong body. There is nothing wrong with my body. What's wrong, what the distress comes from, is when other people look at me or hear me talk and they make assumptions about me that just simply aren't true. And so gender dysphoria can lead to a slew of different externalizing and internalizing impacts. So this is where we see high rates of anxiety, depression, high rates of self-harm and suicidal ideation. We may see people come off as standoffish or asocial or aggressive, all because of this piece of trying to protect themselves from dysphoria or potentially being misgendered. I really like this little graphic. It's these two bunnies. The one says, "What the hell is that?" And the other, with all this stuff coming out of their brain, says, "Oh, it's just my mind." I think all of us can relate to these bunnies sometimes. I definitely feel more like the one on the right than the one on the left for the majority of my life, but sometimes it's easy to ignore, right? So gender dysphoria, like any other form of emotional distress, can ebb and flow based on internal and external stimuli. Sometimes we don't even notice it. I have a, what is it called? Essential oil diffuser. Couldn't think of the word. I have a diffuser going in my room and it makes a noise. I can hear it through my headphones, but it doesn't distract me. I'm still present. I can focus on my slides. I can look at what slides are coming next. I can look at the survey results. All of the things that are going on, I'm able to pay attention to. Sometimes my gender dysphoria is like a huge jet engine sitting right next to me, and there's no way I can hear my own thoughts, let alone what anyone else in a room may be thinking. And sometimes my gender dysphoria is super unpredictable and I don't know when it's going to flare up. Sometimes I have an idea of when it's going to flare up. Doctor's appointments suck as a trans person who has not legally changed their name. You go into the office, you check in at the front desk, even though I've told them time and time again, "Hey, my name is Evan." For some reason, they still don't look in the nickname section. And so they're like, "We don't have an appointment for an Evan." So I have to disclose my dead name. I have to disclose my old name. I don't know who's overheard it. I don't know if it was just myself and this person at the front desk, or if there are other people sitting behind me who heard it. Doesn't matter. I heard it. I said it. I'm now associated with this name. I go and I sit down. I wait for someone to call me back. I don't know what name they're going to call now. I don't know if they're going to call Evan or another name that is not who I am. And I look like this. So when people hear a female name and then see a person who they're going to assume is female, oh my God, I have to live with that now. I have to sit in that now. And so I'm sitting there and the whole time I'm waiting for the person to call my name. It's building, 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 so that it may not even matter what name they call. My dysphoria is already up at a 10. I am gone. I am missing vital medical information about myself and my own health because I am so stuck in my own dysphoria. Everything is like nails on a chalkboard and I cannot focus. And so knowing this piece, that our dysphoria is something that we have to navigate all the time. We have to be minimizing it in the ways that we can. We have the support tools that we know work. I won't go to the doctor alone. I bring my sister with me, which is like super awkward when it's the gyno, but I refuse to go into a doctor's appointment without somebody there who is going to advocate for me because I can't do it in those moments. And so knowing this piece, that it does impact every component of our life. The only treatment for gender dysphoria is transition. It's really important that we're mindful that transition is not just a medical thing. There are many components to transition. We talk about social transition as that piece of changing name, pronouns, gender presentation. Medical transition is what our society, kind of sticks on. This is that piece of hormones, maybe surgeries. Not all trans people may want to access all of these things. I always say that transition is a lot more like a salad bar than a checklist. And I don't like tomatoes on my salad, so I'm not going to put them on my salad. I'm still eating a salad. I may choose not to access medical transition. I am still a person who is transitioning, right? So knowing that piece that not all of these steps are required. The final piece that we talk about is this piece of legal transition. This is changing name and or gender marker. It does have a financial component, so that can be a barrier to individuals. But what's not a barrier is in the state of California, they have a non-binary gender marker. It's represented by this X. Now I have my own feelings about the X, but what this act says, what this bill says, is that the state of California recognizes that I exist. That's a big deal. I'll take that. That's a victory for me, right? And so this piece of seeing legislation change and being more affirming of the population, this contributes to something that we call gender euphoria or trans joy, the joy from being seen as who we authentically are, from being a part of this community. I love being trans. I tell my kids all the time, I would not change this for anything, right? I have experienced some really crappy situations because of my gender identity. I still would not give that away because of the joy that I experienced. When my mom gave me my name bracelet, the first time my parents used my pronouns correctly, when I meet a kid and they say, I didn't know we were able to be adults, right? This piece of, this is the relief that we experience from being able to navigate the world. And we need to really lean into this idea of gender euphoria, of trans joy, because when we ignore this piece, when we just focus on the dysphoria, when we just focus on those negative statistics, what we're saying is being trans is a death sentence. Being trans is something to pity. When we lean into euphoria, when we acknowledge trans joy, what we're saying is this is just something that people identify as. This is just a part of identity. This is just another component to who people are. And that it's beautiful. And that it's diverse and there's a range of experiences, and all of those experiences are pretty exciting. Elliot Page did a beautiful interview with Oprah where he talks about his trans joy. I also really like this picture in front of the Elliot Page Time article. This is actually Kathy's son when he was getting his first boy haircut. And when we're looking at that picture, that is not the face of a little girl who is suddenly bald. That is the face of a young man who is finally seeing himself in the mirror. That is trans joy. So really leaning into trans joy and celebrating it when you get the chance.
And then looking into, how do parents get to be a part of this? Because a lot of you are parents, you may have friends that have trans and non-binary kids, but these pieces of making sure that that child understands they are unconditionally loved and supported, that no matter what, we love you. Because even though we may think we communicate that well, our kids don't always read it that way. That use of pronouns and names is so vitally important. And we hear so much in our work about, well, I've been calling them this name for 15 years. That's okay. You're going to now call them a different name, and you're going to practice in whatever ways you need to practice. I have one mom that would fold clothes and practice with the name. These are Evan's pants. This is Evan's shirt. They like to wear it when they go out with their friends, and just really having that narrative there, educating yourself about the community like you're doing today, joining support groups, which we offer, and being able to seek out, well-trained mental health and medical providers as needed. These are all steps and activities that parents can take, and that you as allies to these other parents, these friends of yours, can help them in giving guidance a little bit, giving some support for them to move into that.
And so in supporting the population, a large part of it is this piece of the language that we're using, doing things like using the correct name, using the correct pronouns. So knowing this piece of how your language can shape a trans person's experience of their encounter with you. In the English language, we have a lot of pronouns. We have the traditionally feminine she, her, hers. We have the traditionally masculine he, him, his. We have the singular, non-gendered they, them, theirs. And for many of us, we might get stuck on the fact that we've been conditioned to believe that they, them is explicitly a plural pronoun. But when we look back at our history, when we look at how the English language has been used historically, we can see that they, them has been used as a singular since the 1300s. Shakespeare used the singular they. And we kind of uphold him as like a pinnacle of English writing. So I think we can get behind it today. And we use the they singularly subconsciously all the time. Oh, they left the package at the door. Who left their water bottle on the desk? I don't know whose water bottle it is. We're in a pandemic, so it's certainly not 6 people's water bottle. It's one person's water bottle. But I'm going to say they because I don't know whose it is. And so it's that piece of bringing it to consciousness, having one person standing in front of you and continuing to use the they and ignoring the part of your brain that wants to default into those gendered signals based on those external cues. I need to practice pronouns all the time. The last pronoun that we have on here is an example of a neo pronoun or a new pronoun. This is the z's or zers pronoun. I mess up pronouns all the time. I certainly mess up neo pronouns all the time. I had a kiddo who came into my support group and said, hey, Evan, I want to start using z's or pronouns. And I said, great, thank you so much for telling me. And when this kid logged out of group, I looked at my co-facilitators and I said, oh my God, what are we going to do? I'm going to mess this up. So we practiced. Just like Kathy said, we practiced simple sentences. Okay, Z goes to the store with Zer mom. Z walked Zer dog. Z drew that picture all by Zerself. We practiced using the Z, Zer pronouns, and I got pretty good at it because I get to practice it every time I do this training. And so this piece of it's okay to make mistakes. No one's expecting you to be perfect in your language, especially when we have years of conditioning to undo. But when we make mistakes, allowing yourself to be corrected in those mistakes. When somebody says, I think you meant Z, being able to say, you're right, I did. I meant Z, and you move on. You don't need to make a big deal of it. When you feel that little bit of discomfort from realizing, ooh, I messed up, sit in that discomfort because that's how trans people feel a lot of the time. And so being able to say like, okay, I'm taking this into account. I'm using this, I'm going to grow from this, and I'm going to try not to make that mistake again.
And so real quickly, I just want to go through 4 knowledge pieces of it, some of the laws. So we have a lot of federal laws and state laws around privacy. We really spend a lot of time when we do trainings for teachers on this. And the important thing to know is that if somebody tells you about their gender identity, you, no matter what your role is as a nurse, as a teacher, as a whatever, you do not have the right to share that information with anyone else without that person's permission. So can't be the parent's permission, has to be that person's permission. And so these laws just all, including the California Constitution, protect that right. And then, you know, there are laws that we have as far as school and keeping students safe, in particular LGBTQ students or those that are perceived to be. And then this AB 1266 is the California state law that really gives most of the protections and rights to our trans kids. This law is twofold. It says that our students have the right to use the locker room, bathroom, and sports team that best matches their gender identity. It also says that our students have the right to change their name and gender marker in all unofficial school documents without parent permission. And so the piece around unofficial school documents, the California state superintendent refers to official school documents as state testing. So that would be PE and academic state testing. So this means our students have the right to change their name and gender marker on everything else, report cards, school IDs, all of that, even without parent permission. It's important that the counselors at school have conversations with students before they change it if their parents aren't aware of it, because the parents logging into school systems could out our students. So in this active ally piece around protecting and being there for trans individuals, what else can you do? Being visible is so vitally important. Being visible doesn't mean that you have to fly a huge 4-foot flag outside your home or in your office. It could be something small, you know, something if you wear a lanyard for work, putting a rainbow sticker on there, something small in your office cubicle, anything like that. It states not only to the LGBTQ person, but to the family members of that person that you are a safe place. Do you think about your interactions day in and day out? How many of those people maybe do have same-sex parents? or maybe have a sibling or an auntie or an uncle who identifies in the community. And so this allows them to know that you're safe. So if they're sharing information with you, or if you're trying to build rapport with them, it's going to be a lot easier if they have that symbol out front that you are a safe person. Speaking up every time we hear harassments or slurs. This is so vitally important in our community. You know, we've got so much going on in people helping to create an inclusive community across San Diego County right now. And so if we can step in, and you don't have to be confrontational about it. You know, you're standing in line at Starbucks and hear somebody say something, just saying, wow, I don't know if you know how disrespectful that is. You know, if it's on a school campus, we teach teachers just being able to say something as simple as, we don't talk like that here. It doesn't have to go into this big explanation. You don't have to worry about, I don't know enough to educate. That's not what it's about. It's about shutting it down immediately when it's said. The other action step we can take as individuals is getting rid of this gendered language. And this graphic is a fun thing in particular for our teachers, because we're so ingrained to separate children by boy and girl, and getting out of that and stop addressing people. If I were to address all of you as ladies and gentlemen, where would that put Evan? It completely discounts Evan. We do trainings for the San Diego County District Attorney's Office and helping those attorneys to move away from ladies and gentlemen of the jury and moving them towards practicing members of the jury, because again, not everybody fits in those categories. So getting creative, if you are around young kids, they'll appreciate you getting really creative and sharing some of these other outside of the box kind of things instead of saying boys or girls. And then wrapping up, you know, Evan talked about the uncomfortableness that we can feel when we do make a mistake, when we misgender somebody, when we call them by the wrong name. Being okay in that uncomfortableness. Our discomfort is many times where our habits start to change. And so that can be really significant. The other piece is being respectful. Think before you say something. Think before you ask something. You know, so many times microaggressions that, you know, they come across because we didn't stop to think about. We use an example of, you know, comments made like, she's so pretty for a trans girl. And while the intention of the person may have been to give a compliment, it does not come out that way. You know, it implies that trans girls can't be pretty. And we could just say, she's so pretty, and leave it at that, and not have to bring somebody's identity into it. So being thoughtful about that. Owning those mistakes when you do misgender somebody, just owning up to it. And it doesn't, not apologizing, because if you apologize to a trans person for misgendering, it's almost like the onus is on them to tell you it's okay, and it's not okay. So if you make a mistake, you know, simply saying, oh, I meant them, I meant they, I meant Evan, I meant he, using any of those things in that. If you get called out by someone, again, there's no need to apologize. Being called out is uncomfortable, but just saying, yes, thank you, you're right, I meant Evan. And leaving your discomfort within yourself rather than trying to make yourself feel better by apologizing. And then, you know, right back where we started in the beginning, talking about bias, we all have biases. They are a part of who we are. The problem becomes when we don't recognize those biases and overcome them in order to be able to have a deeper understanding and more empathy for the folks that were around. So I am going to stop sharing. Evan will put in the chat box all of our contact information for you. We're going to move into some Q&A. And just before we get started, I just want to say that this is an educational setting, so there are no wrong or inappropriate questions here. We're happy, Evan and I are both very open and happy to answer any questions you may have, conversations you want to have. Evan is also putting in the chat box our post survey. We really appreciate you taking a moment and filling that out. It's a handful of questions. It's completely anonymous. just records data for us. And then if you are at all interested in following our work and staying on top of, we offer live stream events that are educational, so you could dive deeper into it. There is a link in the chat that you can go to sign up for our newsletter. And one other thing in the chat is our handouts. Thank you, because I almost forgot about the handouts. We do have a Google Doc basically that we put all of our handouts in. This allows you to have live links, so you can go and kind of do that rabbit hole thing, and also allows us to be able to be constantly updating them. So you might want to bookmark that for future reference. So with that, I'm going to stop talking. You can feel free to put your questions in the chat box or just unmute yourself and let's have a conversation.
Thank you so much, y'all. I'm really interested to know about mandated reporter stuff. I watch families harm kids all the time, and I'm over it. It is doing damage. It is hurting these people, and I'm over it. And so I don't know why I even second guess why I should or should not report, but this seems to me as though we know that not supporting our students in every way, shape, and form is damaging to them. And if they're not receiving gender affirming, safe home environments, in my opinion, that's abuse. Correct me if I'm wrong.
So there is absolutely that piece of, you know, we can see statistically how things like preventing our trans and non-binary kiddos from being affirmed, preventing our trans and non-binary kiddos from access to gender affirming treatment. We do see how that corresponds to things like higher rates of suicidality, higher rates of self-harm. And so we can correlate this to being something that is harmful for our youth in order to be a barrier. Unfortunately, I would say that there is some, I don't know, there are a lot of, there's a lot of layers to this. Like it was just said in the chat, in Texas, it's legally treated as abuse to support and affirm trans youth, right? And so that is something that we are very aware of right now. They're trying to pass some similar legislation in Alabama. And so this piece of, you know, we as providers and we as clinicians and mandated reporters, what we can do in those situations is we can say something to the kids, because they may have an opinion. It may be that they're not out at home and they're not willing to be out at home. It may be that they have come out before, and to bring it up again would just make matters worse. And so having a conversation with these youth to say things like, hey, what can I do to support you? How can I make school a safe environment for you? I realize that home cannot be that environment for you right now. Let's make school safe. And then connecting them with resources, things like our organization. We do support groups for middle schools, high